Eyes on Longmont, offering a diversity of topics about our community that will inform and entertain you. We invite you to sit back and enjoy this edition of Eyes on Longmont.
Nestled in a valley in the Boulder Canyon area just off the Peak to Peak Highway and State Highway 119 is the small mountain town of Nederland, Colorado, at an altitude of about 8,000 feet. Even though Nederland is a rather remote place for a carousel, one can be found there. It is the home of the Carousel of Happiness, a nearly 30-year project of builder Scott Harrison.
Well, I'm Scott Harrison. This is a carousel that I created over the last 30 years. It's a Carousel of Happiness. It's a community carousel now, and we're just about to go in. We are open every day in the summer and weekends year-round. I'm going to go on in. We're about to ride. This is Zane and Taryn. Shall we go? All right. I can't remember riding a carousel as a kid. I grew up outside of Dallas, Texas, and went to the state fair where there still is a really nice old carousel. So unlike most people who are really into carousels, I don't have childhood memories of carousels. What I do remember while I was still a teenager, being a Marine in Vietnam, 18, 19 years old. I was a machine gunner right near the DMZ in Vietnam. And one care package came from my family. My sister had sent me a little music box that you wind up, and I would wind it up, put it next to my ear, and in listening to the music of the music box, I would think of a little carousel in a very peaceful mountain meadow with people having picnics along the hillside, and it just took away the war and the chaos of what was going on. And I would do that in between firefights. Most of the guys had some sort of mechanism to get their mind out of what they were involved in. So I would just sit there and listen to that. And it was that image of a peaceful scene that involved a carousel that helped me quite a bit in Vietnam. I decided to dedicate the opening day of the carousel to two friends of mine that had died the day I was wounded, which was the day before the Tet Offensive in 1968 in Vietnam. Two fellow Marines who were just really good friends of mine. And so I made up a plaque for them and put it up in the carousel. It's not very conspicuous, but it's something that people can see when they go over there. And we dedicated the carousel to all vets. We do every Memorial Day, and specifically for these two guys, Paul Christmas and Christian Langenfeld. Christian was 18, Paul was 23, I think. I chose to put the carousel in Nederland because I live here, I brought up my family here. My wife and I love this town, this area, and we have no plans to go anyplace else. So We definitely, from the very beginning, once we realized we were building a carousel, we wanted to have it somewhere in Nederland. I also wanted, once I finished carving the animals, to try to incorporate this carousel into the community and make it a community-based carousel. So I created a 501c3 corporation, nonprofit organization, called the Carousel of Happiness, and donated the carousel to that organization. And it was at that time that we started looking for some land as a nonprofit community-based organization. We found a piece of land right on the Peak to Peak Highway. This piece of land was leased to us for $1 a month for a 30-year lease. So we have that. That was donated by the Carousel family. And since it fronts on the Peak to Peak Highway, we get a lot of people who are passing through Nederland to stop off and visit the carousel. I have been thinking about carving carousel animals for just about my whole life, just to see if I could do it. After my family and I moved to Nederland, Colorado, and I built a house, I had some leftover lumber from the house, and not carving wood, but just some leftover fir and pine and redwood and a little bit of oak. And I carved a rabbit that I had tried to copy, an old carousel rabbit that I had seen that I was really impressed with. I did a fair job of carving it, but I enjoyed it, and I carved a couple of other animals. It was really a way for me to balance my work life and family life with something that I just got a lot of satisfaction from. First, I would create a drawing, kind of a blueprint. I would go to a lumber yard in Denver that sells hardwood, and I would buy basswood. All these animals are made of basswood. These animals are made of 2-inch thick basswood planks, and so I would cut them out with the different shapes of the legs and the head, glue them together. Sometimes I would use a wooden dowel to help the strength in putting them together. But all these animals, with no exception, are simply wooden boards glued together. They're then shaped and carved using a combination of electric sanders. I use a disc sander when I'm shaping them sometimes, and then I use a variety of different knives and gouges to carve the wood. Basswood is a popular wood for carving carousel animals. They've used it for 150 years. It's from the linden tree, and it's a kind of a soft hardwood, so it's a good wood to use for carving. I learned to carve just by trying it out. I've never gone to a class or learned from a master. My style of carving is really a fairly simple one. I'm still getting better. I've carved 62 animals and I'm still learning how to do it. When it all gets painted and put together, it all looks good, but there's a progression of carving techniques that I've learned and still am. When I would carve an animal, I would try to learn something about it. So for instance, while I'm carving one animal, let's say a rabbit, I would plan on the next one. And that the one after the first one was a giraffe. So I would go to the library and learn about giraffes, read folk tales, get pictures of giraffes from National Geographic, whatever I could find in the library, songs, poems about giraffes, trying to get the essence of the animal. And then I would make a blueprint or a drawing of that animal that I wanted to put on the carousel. I would scale that drawing so that I could work off of it for the carving. Then when I started to carve it, each animal is a box. It's called a coffin design. So each animal has a void inside. And so I just thought that I would fill that void sometimes, not always, with just different things like a time capsule, just for fun. I'm doing this really just for fun at this point as I'm carving each animal. I might draw in the inside wood, write up a little haiku or a poem that I made up. Might put a newspaper in there. So something that might be interesting for somebody that digs it up a long time from now. Carousel carvers in the late 1800s and early 1900s often signed their work inside the animals. So it's not something for other people to enjoy, but it kept me amused. I didn't think that I wanted to try to replicate the animals that were on this carousel. These animals were carved by master carvers back in the turn of the last century. So I carved animals that were of my own style. Most carousels had mostly horses. And a lot of times the scary looking, the ferocious, open-mouthed, big-toothed animals turned out that the little kids didn't want to ride on those. So I thought, I would carve animals that had kind of a gentleness to them. I also, just for my own sense, since I was doing this, from my own sensibilities, I wanted to carve animals that reflected the essence of the animal. So, for instance, a panda bear. I tried to do some sort of representation of a panda bear that reflected what that animal looks like in the wild. For instance, the lion, I wanted him to look majestic. I wanted to respect what a lion really is, but I didn't want to scare kids, and I wanted to make sure that little kids wanted to get on. So all the animals have different poses. Some of them are standing, some of them are galloping or running, walking. They're looking in different directions. Most of the animals have some sort of sense about them that reflects a respect for who they are and what they are. After I carved a few animals, I came across a carousel frame. I had learned of a carousel mechanism and frame that was abandoned in Utah at the Utah State Training School, and it had been bought by a collector who had bought it just for the animals. These animals go for a lot of money in auction houses as folk art. And so this person wanted the carousel just for the animals. She took the animals, and then I learned of the carousel frame and mechanism, something that I could afford. It was about to be bulldozed and sold for scrap metal. And so I bought it from her and went and took it apart. I brought it back to Nederland, and I was on my way to restore the mechanism, and then I kept carving animals. That was in 1986. When I found the frame of this carousel, I started learning about the history of it. This mechanism that includes all the bearings and the center pole, the horse hanger poles and the floor hanger poles, everything that kind of makes up the carousel itself, came from an amusement park called Saltair Park right outside of Salt Lake City in Utah. It was a large amusement park that was built by the Mormon Church in the 1870s, and it was built a mile out on the Great Salt Lake. It was both an amusement park and a swimming park. The carousel was delivered in 1910 by Charles Loof. And Charles Loof was one of the major carousel producers of the late 1800s and early 1900s in the United States. Charles Loof was a Danish immigrant who came over to the United States, to New York, in 1870. Worked in a furniture factory as a teenager and a young adult. He made, using scraps that he brought home from the furniture factory, he carved a set of primitive horses and created the first carousel at Coney Island in 1876. And he went on from there to make some major carousels around the country, both on the East Coast, and then he moved his operations in the early 1900s to Santa Monica, California. He made carousels that are still standing, still running in Spokane, Washington, San Francisco, San Diego, and Santa Cruz Boardwalk. So this carousel that was again delivered to Saltair Park was first a 4-row jumping carousel. So that means that there were 4 rows of animals. At one point in its history, the neighboring roller coaster blew over on top of the carousel in a fierce windstorm. It partially destroyed the carousel, and it was rebuilt as a 2-row carousel, which is what it is today. The carousel was involved in 3 major fires at Saltair. Again, the Saltair Park was out on a series of piers, and 3 major fires almost completely destroyed the park. The carousel survived all those fires, and one reason is that fire departments were told to go to the carousel first, since it had a lot of carving on it and a lot of work done. So that happened at this park, and the carousel was always saved. So it survived that. It was then survived a bankruptcy. The park went bankrupt in 1958. The governor of Utah gave the carousel to the state school a couple of miles away in American Fork, Utah in 1959. They reset it up in a park that they called Fairyland on the state school grounds. When it was there from 1959 to 1986. It was hit by lightning one time, and then it was broken apart by a collector who came and took the animals. So it's quite the survivor, and it made me feel good to be part of its history, to try to put it back together. One thing that I wanted to do was to keep as much of the mechanical aspect, the machine, together and not replace that. We still use the original 1909 motor. It's a General Electric 10-horse motor that has been used throughout its whole history, and it still runs today. We use the original switch, which is a trolley car switch that was used in the very beginning. All the bearings, all the gears are all original to this carousel. A few of the bearings are Loof bearings, but they are from different Loof carousels. So I've been helped by some other carousels to help me put this one together mechanically when I needed to. When I started to restore the mechanism itself, which involved a lot of machine work and welding and fixing of some of the broken bearings and that sort of thing, I needed to find people who were interested in carousels and had the ability to work with metal. So quite a few people in Nederland helped me, and still do help, keep up the mechanical aspect of the carousel, make sure that it runs well, that it's safe to operate, safe to ride. So I have been really blessed by the friendship and the assistance of an awful lot of people who are kind of gearheads and are interested in the mechanical part of the carousel. Carousels are mostly built to hang from one bearing at the top of the center pole, and this is one of those carousels. There is one roller bearing at the very top of the center pole. Everything hangs down from that bearing. All the riders, the horses, the platform. There's nothing that connects the platform to the floor of the building. Some carousels are called track carousels, and they do run on rollers. They don't hang. Very few of those carousels survive. When I got this carousel in 1986, it was a big mess. It had the original 1910 mechanism, but then it had been in several disasters. The original wood frame here was in pretty bad shape. First of all, it was 100 years old, but also it had been hit by lightning, it had been charred by some fires, and so I decided not to try to restore the wood. It was just it wasn't safe. So I replaced all the wood. The platform was a plywood platform that had been replaced in the 1940s, so that didn't have the original platform. And this carousel has 18 sections, so it has 18 wedges that make up a circular platform. I wanted a platform that looked like the original. The original was made with southern yellow pine. This was made back in 1910. And so I went on a nationwide search of southern yellow pine. And I found some, this was about 15 years ago, that had been this whole batch of southern yellow pine that makes up the current platform was cut down in 1890. So this wood is actually older than the carousel itself. It was cut down in 1890, and made into shelving for whiskey barrels at a Seagram's plant in Peoria, Illinois. So it lived for 100 years holding whiskey barrels in Peoria, Illinois, and then they tore that plant down and put the wood back up on the used wood market. And I found out about it and bought all this wood and made the platform with it. So it has a different story, not a carousel story, but it has an interesting life before its carousel life. I created the platform as it would have been built back in 1910 using dowels and curved radius for the circular platform. The music for this carousel is provided by a 1913 Wurlitzer band organ. It's a military band organ model 125. It has 102 instruments that play off of a paper roll. I bought this band organ knowing that I'd have to have a band organ at some point. And this band organ is sitting in the middle of the carousel and plays waltzes, marches. Right now we also have some swing music. Typically there are 10 tunes on each paper roll. And the band organ is made, of course, back before there were speakers or electronic music, so they made it as loud as possible. And so there's 102 instruments. We have it in a sound cabinet to keep all of the music inside the carousel building, simply because you could hear it throughout the town if we didn't have a sound cabinet for it. But it's very loud in here, and it's just perfect for the carousel experience. This style of Wurlitzer was originally created for carousels and ice skating and roller skating rinks. And I just don't know what this particular band organ, how it was originally used. On the outside of the carousel, we have rounding board paintings, and in between each rounding board painting, I've created a little stage with a sculpture, and there are 18 sections to this carousel, so there are 18 sculptures. As the carousel goes around, I thought it would be fun to have a little simple animation that people could look at as they're watching the carousel go around. So I carved, and in progression, it's an egg, a swan in different poses come out of the egg and then present himself with his wings wide open in his majesty, and then he comes back down in a couple of poses back into an egg, and this is as the carousel moves along in different sculptures, and turns into a little girl who will come out of the egg in a couple of poses, and she presents herself with her arms wide open. She comes back down into the egg in a couple of more poses and turns into a frog. And the frog, in his own goofy way, spreads his arms or frog legs or whatever, and then he presents himself and then goes back down into the egg and turns back into a swan again. The idea is to use a swan and a frog and a little kid as transformative figures, just to sort of pique the imagination of people who are watching the carousel go around. In between the sculptures are old paintings, oil on tin, that were painted in 1910 for A carousel in St. Joseph, Missouri, created in 1910, but it was a different carousel than this one. The guy's name is August Wolfinger, and he was a German immigrant who painted carousel and circus art when he came over to the United States. He was called the Michelangelo of the Midway by a Brooklyn newspaper back in the first part of the 20th century. I had them restored by a man who's since passed away in Denver, who restored fine art, and he did the restoration of all these paintings, kind of just as a volunteer, because he just really appreciated the art. It's really folk art more than fine art. On the inside of the rounding boards are another set of paintings that are endangered species. They're oval paintings that were painted by a Russian immigrant for a carousel in San Antonio, Texas in the 1990s. They decided they didn't want them before he delivered them, and so the person who was putting that deal together just gave me the paintings, and since we already had outside ones, I put them on the inside. And actually you can see them better than the outside ones because of the how small the building is.
When Scott Harrison saw a photograph of a little girl dancing with joy, published in Boulder's Daily Camera newspaper in 1999, he saved the photograph and eventually carved her image into what he called the twirling girl. Real-life Eliana, now a teenager, has visited the carousel many times, including the groundbreaking ceremony in 2008. This carving of Eliana Dreyfus has become the carousel muse who spins around atop the carousel, looking like a wide smiling conductor of the music and the dance of the carousel animals. The carousel is housed in a 12-sided river rock and wooden structure designed by local architect Debbie Davenport and Scott Harrison. They are proud of the fact that many environmentally sensitive materials went into its construction. Solar panels adorn the roof, which provide much of the electricity needed to run the carousel. LED lighting helps to reduce the electrical requirements. In-floor radiant heating keeps the building comfortable during cold winter days.
We created the nonprofit organization that allowed us to start fundraising for the building. We started out with no debt because we started out with a carousel and a band organ, but then we had zero money in our bank account, but we also didn't have any debt. So then we started fundraising, applying for grants from area foundations, sponsorships for adoptions for the animals, sponsorships for different parts of the building from area businesses and individuals in Boulder County and in the whole Front Range. So we were able to raise money for the building, and then once we got a little bit of money started, then we started construction. We started fundraising right when the recession hit nationally, so it wasn't a great time for us to fundraise. It did help us, since so many people were out of work, we did get a lot of volunteers to help us build the building. So we had, at any one day, we might have a dozen to 2 dozen people volunteering who knew what they were doing in the construction of the building. So that helped us out quite a bit. We've been in operation for about 2.5 years now. We're still working on our business plan, but we do make enough money to run the carousel and the organization. We do that in a couple of different ways. First of all, most of the people that keep the carousel running are volunteers. We have an annual fundraiser which helps us to run the business of the carousel. We have a gift shop that helps out the budget. We decided from the very beginning to keep the ride cost down as much as possible. So we only charge $1 per person to ride the carousel. And we intend to keep that price at $1 for as long as we can, and so far it looks like that's in the foreseeable future we'll be able to do that. We're in the black. We get most of our money, like most places in the mountains, in the summer, and then we kind of partially shut down during the winter. Although we're open year-round on weekends. Every weekend we're open, and some weekdays.
What is this? Panda? Yeah. And what's the page writing? A kangaroo? What's down here? A baby kangaroo, yeah. You having fun? Here they go. I heard the gong. What song are they gonna play now? It's going faster. It's gonna go faster. Here it goes. Yes? Yes? You want a kiss? Paige, are you waving, Paige? Are you waving? Wave at the tiger. Wave at the tiger. Yeah, looking at you. You having fun? You waving at the people? Waving all the people? Yay! Hold on tight. Yeah, kick your feet. Make that kangaroo go. More people to wave at.
For the first 20 years of carving the animals and restoring the mechanism, I had no idea what we would call the carousel or where it would be. As we got closer to actually realizing the goal of putting this carousel up and opening it up as a business, I often thought about what the name would be, and it just seemed to be a natural name for a carousel. It would be Carousel of Happiness. Carousel itself is a reflection of happiness and vice versa. So I can't believe that no other carousel is called a Carousel of Happiness. I can't believe that no other carousel is called a Carousel of Happiness.